Now for Raising the Bar, Greater RVA's premier Law Talk radio show. Call into the show with your stories and questions at 804-454-1366. 804-454-1366.
Good morning and welcome to Raising the Bar, the Law Talk radio show. This is Colleen Quinn, your host. I'm an attorney at Locke & Quinn. Our offices are conveniently located at Willow Lawn, where you can come get your dining experiences via a plethora of various restaurants. We just had the Chopped added lately, and of course we have the Chipotle right next door, and then we of course have the Chick-fil-A just a couple of doors over. So come get your legal services in employment law, personal injury, family law, estate planning, and a variety of other personal services, while you also can dine to your absolute delight in the Willow Lawn area at Locke & Quinn. So today we are going to talk about medical mishaps. My doctor screwed up and I don't have a case. Really? There's so many misconceptions around medical treatment and when somebody does or does not have a claim. And if you have a question for us today, please call in at 804-454-1366 with your questions with regarding to medical mishaps and medical malpractice this morning. Remember that Raising the Bar Law Talk radio show brings you an interesting dynamic topic every Wednesday morning at 9 a.m. Please be sure to tune into the show. And if you miss the show, remember that we are on Facebook Live and the videos are recorded there. We also now have the podcast up on iTunes, so you can subscribe to the series Raising the Bar Law Talk radio show. And of course, remember that not everyone has access to legal services and to the law. Sometimes lawyers can be expensive. And so on the Raising the Bar Law Talk radio show webpage, we have posted all of the free and lower cost legal services that are available throughout Virginia to Virginia citizens with regard to various legal areas, including services for veterans and folks with disabilities, and just a variety of different services that are available out there. So joining me this morning, of course, is my very pleasant associate, Kati Kitts Dean, and she will be prompting me with questions with regard to medical malpractice. Good morning, Kati.
Good morning, Colleen.
So today we are going to talk about medical malpractice cases. At Locke & Quinn, we do handle these cases, but it is very, very rare that you find a case that actually has merit to take forward. So we screen quite a number of cases that come through before we actually find one that is worthy of taking forward. So, and there are a lot of reasons for that, right?
There absolutely are. So let's get started. Can you explain to our listeners what are the basic elements of a medical malpractice case?
So just like personal injury cases, you pretty much, I hold up the three fingers and I say you've got to have liability, you have to have damages, and then you have to be able to collect. 1, 2, 3. Those are the three big fingers. And then, of course, oftentimes I'll turn those fingers upside down and say the collection part is really sometimes the most important part we have to look to first, because if you're not going to be able to collect anything for a client, then if there's liability and there are damages, it doesn't matter. You know, you're not going to be able to take that case forward. So I always reverse the order on those. And then with medical malpractice cases, the liability becomes a lot trickier because it's not like somebody just ran a red light and caused a car accident.
Right.
You have to show both negligence by the medical provider and that negligence was then the proximate cause of the injury. And that becomes a lot harder to show when there's like complications from a surgery or something like that. It's just med mal cases tend to be a lot more complicated than your average motor vehicle accident case.
Right. And on that liability piece, I mean, there's kind of extra steps that you have to take when you're even starting to bring the case, right?
Yes, absolutely. So generally, before you can serve the lawsuit, not necessarily before you file it, but before you serve it in Virginia, you have to have an expert certification in your back pocket or in your file.
Mhm.
So, and what that means is that you need to have a certification by another expert that's in the same area of practice. So, for example, if it's a plastic surgery case, then and the plastic surgeon screwed up, then you need to have another plastic surgeon basically say that that first plastic surgeon violated the medical standard of care for plastic surgeons in that area of practice. Same thing if you had a internal medicine doctor or an emergency room doctor or an orthopedic surgeon, you would have to go get an expert in that particular field to sign a certification that based on their review of the facts and the medical records, et cetera, that they find that that doctor violated the standard of care. And you have to do it for nurses and other health professionals as well.
Right. So you talked about collection being one of the big factors you have to consider, but most medical providers have malpractice insurance. So why would there be any issues with collection?
Well, and that's a great question because you would think medical malpractice insurance would cover, but then we run into these situations where if the act was intentional, and so if you have like an intentional sexual assault, then the medical malpractice will say, well, that's not under our coverage. We're not going to cover that. And you get into these gray areas where, so I had I've had a number of these psychiatrist cases, Katie, which is really bizarre, but where there's this impulse to touch breasts. I don't quite get why I've had such a slew of these cases. But we had this one case against this one doctor who actually was giving money to his patients, and as part of it, he would fondle their breasts, and it was really bizarre because it ended up there ended up being at least 15 women that we became aware of. So, and of course, complaints were filed with the Board of Health Professionals, and eventually he lost his license. Well, we were trying to collect for one gal that had been subject to, and I mean, you go to a psychiatrist because you're vulnerable, you're looking for counseling, etc. And what happens is when you have these types of cases, it just kind of messes folks up even more, unfortunately. Well, in this particular case, this doctor, because of the prior complaints, already had lost his license, already had stopped practicing, of course, since he lost his license. And the malpractice insurance wasn't covering because it was an intentional act. And so when we went to try to collect, there really was nothing to collect from. So we were able to dip into his personal assets to some extent to get a small recovery. But in that case, you would think, okay, there should be coverage, but in that case, there wasn't.
Right.
We also have had other cases where you find that the doctor might have done an intentional act, and then when we look at the assets, his personal assets might be all tied up with a spouse. So yeah.
If you're trying to go after the personal
assets, then you're not able to. And it could be that when you actually look at the physician practice, that it's leveraged to the hilt with credit card debt and back rent and stuff like that. And so you would think that in these cases, of course, you'd have deep pockets with doctors, but not necessarily in all those cases.
Right.
So basically, we've talked a little bit about the psychiatrist case. In those cases too, one of the first things that happens is that they go before the Board of Health Professionals or the Board of Medicine, depending on the level of practice. And if they go before one of those boards and then they lose their license, the timing of bringing a case becomes really critical because, first of all, if they go before the board and the act is kind of deemed intentional, now the malpractice carrier is going to deny coverage. And then if they lose their license, well, now they're out of practice. And so in these cases, if you have to kind of bring them fast,
right? So that there's money to get.
right. So that you can get them go after the money.
Right. So getting back to sort of this issue of breaching the standard of care, which you said you have to have, an expert certifying, when you're bringing a case that there was a standard of care that was breached. How do you sort of suss out this issue of when is it just a health professional that wasn't very good versus somebody that breached the standard of care, and you can actually bring a suit against them?
Right. So there are a lot of cases where folks find that a medical provider may just not have a good bedside manner.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and don't get me wrong. I mean, I personally have had fabulous doctors and health professionals, but it's just like lawyers. Occasionally you get a bad apple in the bunch, and so there occasionally are professionals out there that they're just they're not as friendly. They're just not quite as good. So we do get a lot of calls at Lock and Quinn where somebody's just not happy with the way that their doctor has treated them.
Mm-hmm.
They're not responsive in returning calls. They feel like they don't spend enough time with them when they go to the visits. There are just various complaints about the level of care. They don't explain things well. Well, that's not malpractice. That's just basically not really being the best medical professional.
Bad customer service.
Bad customer service, exactly. And then you get cases too where the doctor might actually have messed up, but it's so. For example, you go for surgery. Well, there are a lot of different possible risks of surgery. So you could have a risk of surgery, including some other body part being nicked during a laparoscopy or something that wasn't supposed to be nicked, but it's also a known risk that could be nicked during that surgery. And you also have risks of certain side effects after the surgery, of urinary retention or various things that can go wrong from that surgery. So the mere fact that might happen, the nick might happen, the urinary retention might happen, due to the anesthesia or the catheter or whatever. Those are risks that are known that they could happen. So the mere fact that the doctor did accidentally nick the bowel or something, or nick a kidney, or nick a part that wasn't supposed to be nicked, that in and of itself is not malpractice. However, the failure to then identify, via whatever the symptoms were that the person had, that can be the malpractice where they failed to diagnose and treat for a risk
for something that went wrong.
Right, for something that went wrong, but that it was known that could potentially have gone wrong. So we actually had a wrongful death case where the woman went in for a laparoscopic procedure, and she did have her bowel nicked accidentally, and basically when we took the case, the general surgeon that went in and ultimately repaired the nicked bowel, he basically felt like the size of the cut was so big that it shouldn't have happened in the first place.
Went beyond the risk.
Right, it went beyond the risk because he said it was the size of a gunshot wound.
Wow.
I mean, it was big, and it should have been discovered at the time of surgery. And so we inherited the case, and at the time, sometimes when you inherit cases, you inherit them with the theories that are already in place. And so we went forward on that case, actually to trial, on the theory that the cut of the bowel never should have happened in the surgery, especially because it was so big and it should have been caught at the time of surgery. And we were so in any of these cases, you have to identify your experts on the plaintiff's side at least 3 months before the trial. Okay. So we basically identified all of our experts and said that this never should have happened, et cetera. Well, after we identified our experts, the general surgeon that had gone in and done the repair, he pointed out that really the malpractice was not only the cut itself, because it was so large, but then it was the failure to diagnose afterwards, because the poor woman was admitted to the hospital and by the same doctor who did not have an emergency room doctor look at her, did not go to see her until sometime later, and she'd already become septic, because what happens is, because of the nick, the fecal matter from the bowel leaked into her abdominal area, and she became incredibly, incredibly sick. Well, because he did not go see her at the hospital right away, and he did not have an emergency room doctor check on her right away, we actually were not able to bring that theory originally in the case because we were too late.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't really process that theory until within that 3 months. So we go to trial, we get a hung jury. It was the best thing that could happen because we got to bring the case again on the better theory.
Right.
And unfortunately, because sepsis can kick in so fast,
Mm-hmm.
she died. She didn't make it. And that could have been prevented had she been seen right away properly and given the proper protocols and put on the right antibiotics and other medications, which would have prevented the sepsis. And also, in identifying that she was septic, they would have identified that something happened during the surgery, and then the bowel repair would have happened a lot sooner rather than a day and a half later, which was really too late for her. So that's your classic case where, in that case, we had both theories, which was that, yes, there was a risk of her bowel being nicked, but not that to that extent.
Right.
Okay, because that's a huge fecal leak now. And also, we also had the theory that, okay, that's a risk of surgery, but because it's a known risk, you've got to watch that patient afterwards. And if they start having signs of swelling and their temperature changes and their heartbeats changing, and you've got all the different signs that are showing that there's definitely something wrong with that person, then you've got to monitor them and make sure that they get the right follow-up care.
Absolutely. So in these cases, we've said you have to have a doctor to certify that the standard of care was breached. Is that sometimes hard to do, to find these other doctors to, sign off on a case and say, yes, this other doctor in my field did something that was so bad it was malpractice?
Yeah, it is, especially finding local doctors, because, a lot of doctors don't want to, they know these doctors. They run in the same circles. They are in the same medical society or whatever. And so they don't necessarily want to testify against another doctor. So in these cases, when you have a local doctor willing to sign an expert witness certification against another local doctor, well, that kind of shows you the strength of the case, because that's one doctor saying, wow, this was so egregious that I'm willing to sign off on another local doctor. But what you have in a lot of the cases is you will typically end up having to look for experts outside of the local area. In fact, sometimes you have to even look for them in another state. But then you have to make sure that they have a license in Virginia, ideally, even if they are in another state. Maybe they're in DC, but they're also licensed in Virginia as well, so that they're able to testify sufficiently and know the Virginia's standard of medical care.
Right. Yeah. But when you can find a local doctor, I mean, that's an indication that it was really bad and they don't want this person in their circle, I guess, of their profession.
Yeah. I mean, just like lawyers, when we have another lawyer commit legal malpractice, we don't want that happening. And so doctors, they want to police their own too, to some extent, and make sure that they weed out the bad apples and that there aren't folks out there practicing that are, committing wrongs,
Right.
etc. So, yeah, when you do find one local doctor willing to testify against another, that's definitely shows you the strength of your case to some extent.
Right. So when clients call in, they think they have a medical malpractice claim, want to talk to a lawyer about it, what are some of the first things that they really need to understand?
Well, the first thing is explaining to them, we've got liability, damages, collection, and also we can't really even start to look at your case until you gather up all of your medical records. And we really need them to gather up their medical records, because when lawyers ask for medical records, then suddenly red flags go up. It's like, you just, I've seen funny things happen. I've seen medical records disappear. I've seen medical records change. In that one case that I mentioned with the laparoscopic procedure with the nick bowel, we had 3 different operative reports that we ultimately uncovered.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, with different handwritten annotations put on the operative report, including changing the size of the cut area. So it was several different sizes written in there. And so you see these funny things with medical records, and you see funny things happen when lawyers ask for medical records. So we always tell the clients, the potential client, look, you need to go and you need to gather up all of your medical records, which they should have anyway, because if they're going for any subsequent treatment, then they'll have all their records for that next doctor to be able to see.
Mm-hmm.
And they're entitled to get their records.
Right.
They're entitled to get their full records. I mean, everybody should have their medical records, really, and not just the ones that they hand you when you're discharged or whatever, because those are just instructions. They're not really your medical records.
Mm-hmm.
So we tell people, you need to go ahead and you need to gather up all of your medical records so that we can see what's in those medical records. And then we pretty much have to do a lot of research on that particular area of medicine to look at what could possibly be all the different complications. And we just looked at a case this week, where the woman had a laparoscopic procedure a number of years ago, 3 years ago. And now she has a kidney that doesn't function. One of her kidneys she's lost.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the doctors mentioned it was possible something could have happened during that laparoscopic procedure 3 years ago. Well, we looked, and that there are so many different ways in which a kidney can malfunction. And now trying to say that it was because of that laparoscopic procedure 3 years ago,
right,
as opposed to the 49 other reasons why that kidney might be not functioning now, that's just going to be an impossible task. But at a minimum, if we can look at the medical records, we can then kind of sort out, well, what are the other symptoms that person has that could possibly have caused the kidney failure, as opposed to a nick from that laparoscopic procedure? And were there consistent complaints from the time of that procedure forward that would have suggested that happened during the procedure or not? And if they're not consistent complaints in the medical records, well, then that's going to tell us that's just going to be too difficult to try to prove that case. So gathering up those medical records is the very first thing. And then I tell folks the second thing is, have you gone for a second opinion? So you think that your knee replacement, or you think that your shoulder replacement was done wrong. Well, did you go for a second opinion? Have you gotten another doctor to say what's going on with you, that maybe the implant is too big or the implant's too small, or no, these symptoms are actually symptoms that you could probably expect, with the procedure having been done perfectly right. So a lot of folks, they'll call and they'll be second guessing their doctor, and I'm like, well, we're lawyers. Go see another doctor and get another opinion. This is not black and white either, so you might have to get a third opinion too. And remember, today's show, we are talking about medical mishaps and the issue of, a medical provider can screw up, but you may not necessarily have a malpractice case. So we are going to cut to the break here shortly. And if you have any questions, please call us into the show at 804-454-1366. Everybody is affected by medical treatment, and most of us at one time or another have a mishap with some treatments. So please be sure to call in.
You've been listening to Raising the Bar, Greater Richmond's premier law talk radio show. Call into the show with your stories and questions at 804-454-1366. 804-454-1366.
With SRN News, I'm Rich Thomason in Washington. President Trump is touting his immigration plan, saying it takes into account the plight of the so-called Dreamers. During last night's State of the Union speech, Democrats booed when the president mentioned crimes committed by illegal aliens. Also last night, Mr. Trump warned of the threat posed by a nuclear-armed North Korea and by open borders here at home. The president reportedly told a lawmaker last night that he is 100% in favor of releasing a classified memo written by Republicans dealing with the Russia investigation. Following yesterday's massive sell-off and losses on Monday as well, Wall Street appears poised to make a comeback today. Stock futures have been sharply higher. Right now, Dow futures are up 230 points, and NASDAQ futures ahead 35. More details at srnnews.com.
Travel in retirement. It's what you've always wanted to do, but you're not liquidating stocks to take that big trip, are you? And when you downsize to the perfect retirement home, you're not paying the realtor with corporate bonds or munis, right? So why, when you paid for things your entire life with income, wouldn't you plan to have enough income to last throughout your retirement? I'm David Scranton, founder of Sound Income Strategies, and if you are 50 or older, now is the time to focus on your goal. Sound Income Strategies, the secret to a great retirement is in our middle name.
To receive David Scranton's best-selling book, Return on Principle, 7 Core Values to Help Protect Your Money in Good Times and Bad, call 866-913-1234. That's 866-913-1234. And use promo code BOOK. Call 866-913-1234. That's 866-913-1234.
The John Frederick Show.
Well, the fake news, they kind of have a 5-day podcast reshuffle of fake Trump sucks news. This is how it goes. Monday, Russia collusion. Tuesday, mentally unfit. Wednesday, Trump's a racist. Thursday, Trump's going to be indicted. Friday, even Steve Bannon thinks he's nuts. Then they hit the shuffle button and start all over again on Monday.
Ain't nothing fake about J-Fred. Get your truckload of truth every day on The John Frederick Show. Weekdays 6 to 10 a.m. on WNTW, AM 820 and 97.7 FM.
You know what I hate? I hate iPhones. This stupid. I've been trying to download the new version of whatever it is, and I cannot.
I tell you, this is a conspiracy.
It's a con.
The iPhone knows everything that you're doing. They are artificial intelligence, I think.
Well, now I can't control my daughter's iPhone, and I'm not happy about it.
You're just a control freak.
Tune into the Lee Brothers, Fridays, 3 to 6 p.m. here on Richmond's Choice for Conservative Talk Radio, WNTW 820 AM and 97.7 FM. The Answer.
Now, back to Raising the Bar. Call into the show with your stories and questions at 804-454-1366. 804-454-1366.
We are back to Raising the Bar, the Law Talk Radio Show. This is attorney Colleen Quinn of Locke and Quinn, and with me is Kati Kitts Dean. Today we are talking about medical mishaps. My doctor screwed up and I don't have a case? Really? So we get so many of these calls in the office, and it's so difficult to sift through them and determine when there really is a valid medical malpractice claim. If you have any questions, call us at 804-454-1366. We've got another half hour of the show talking about this topic, and we'd love to take your call.
Absolutely. So before we took the break, you were talking about a call we had from someone who had a complaint about a surgery that happened 3 years ago, which brings up an interesting point. What are the time limits on bringing these claims? Great question. Of course, the time limit is the general 2-year statute of limitations in Virginia. Now, it can be different in other states. But when that time limit starts is the big question. It's not necessarily from when the negligence occurred or when the mistake occurred, but if the physician or that medical provider continues to treat that patient, then that period extends the time. So then you look at, okay, when was the last date of treatment? And then you can start the count from there for the 2 years. And then there are other tolling things that can come up. Right. So you're always kind of looking for, are there any other exceptions as well? I think if you find a sponge in someone, but they don't know until later. Exactly. So you've got those inability to identify it type cases, which can also extend that 2 years. So we've got a call from Stuart from Chesterfield. Good morning, Stuart. You are on the air.
How you doing?
I'm doing great.
I was in a bike wreck several years ago, and I got a contusion on my intestines, and then later on it was diagnosed as Crohn's. I switched doctors because I wasn't real confident in this other gastrologist for a while, and then he confirmed that I had Crohn's, and he put me on Humira. My concern was I have a form of muscular sclerosis called CMT type 1A, and it's a neuropathy condition. affecting the myelin sheathing around my nerve endings and my intrinsic muscle areas.
Wow, you have a lot going on there, Stuart.
Yeah. So anyways, I brought this concern to his attention, and I said, hey, is this Humira stuff going to adversely affect my condition? He says, well, let me look into it, because he wasn't familiar with the CMT type 1A. So I was called back about 3 weeks later to go in to learn how to give myself the injections. And this is after trying a couple rounds of prednisone and going through 2 doctors for about a year and this, that, and the other. And I come back in, and his nurse practitioner is there, and she's teaching me how to give myself the injections of Humira. And I asked her, I said, well, is there any problem? Is there going to be any problem, with the CMT type 1A? And she looked at me and she said, what's that? I said, well, the doctor was supposed to be looking into this and getting back to me, this condition that I have. She says, well, let me go talk to him. So she popped out of the room for about maybe 5 minutes, and then pops back in and says, no, he says everything should be fine. So I started taking the Humira, and it literally tore me apart. And I kept telling him, I don't feel right, something's wrong, I'm not getting, he says, well, your body's just getting acclimated to it. It did nothing for my symptoms of Crohn's at all. It just took me in a downward spiral, and I ended up having surgery last year, and they took out what appeared to be the contusion, along with about close to a foot of colon and some lower intestine, about 1.5 feet of that. And since
Holy
then,
cow, you've got a lot going on there.
Yeah, I've made a miraculous recovery. I mean, I was down to 113 pounds from 170.
So, Stuart, what is the medical negligence question that you're getting to?
Well, I started researching on the Humira, and it turns out there's I had to dig quite a bit, and I got some information from a pharmacist finally, and it says right there in the Humira that, I forget what the medical name for the albumin or something like that, it says that may adversely affect people with muscular sclerosis and may cause demineralization of the myelin sheathing.
So
which
have
is the
you,
condition that I've got.
Right, so did you go back and did you talk to your doctor and the nurse practitioner about that then?
Not really. At that point, I just kind of kept my mouth shut.
Well, you should. You should go back. So I'll tell you this. The first thing you did right was you listened to your body. I always tell people, listen to your body. The second thing you absolutely did right was you questioned. And when you have somebody else like a nurse practitioner that you're seeing and you'd seen the doctor before, your continuity of care is now interrupted, and you did the absolute right thing by making sure that you asked the questions again to look into it. And then remember that medical providers, they're constantly encountering new medications. They're not always 100% familiar with them. So I always say, go back to that doctor and ask questions. Ask, why were you prescribed that when those were the known side effects, et cetera? Because sometimes you'll get answers that you may not have otherwise thought that you would get. But I would definitely go back and ask the doctor and the nurse practitioner and tell them what you researched and also what happened, so that you basically put them on the spot about it in that regard. So thank you. Was there?
I'm wondering if that's going to get me anywhere. I've since been referred by him to another doctor out of Charlottesville, and I'm going to see him now, and I'm much more satisfied with him. He's very precautious about my situation after I explained everything that went on, and he always tells me now to go check with my neurologist.
Good.
Before and I'm doing all herbals right now. I'm not on anything.
Well, good for you.
And I'm doing 100% better.
Well, sometimes
I had to learn how to walk again. I mean,
right.
I felt bad at that.
Well, sometimes, certain doctors don't get it right, and then you have to keep looking for one that you're comfortable with, and you did exactly that. You did exactly the right things. But, I would not, just for your own satisfaction, I would not necessarily just let it go. I would write a letter or go see that other doctor and basically say, this didn't work, because that doctor needs to learn that maybe that wasn't the right medication. Thank you so much for calling into the show, Stuart. Really appreciate it.
My question is, do I have a case?
I can't tell you that you have a case, because without doing the medical research myself, I would want to look into that. But one thing that I would note is that your damages are very limited. Although you had a horrible period of time, you are now recovered. And so because that, to trying to quantify that period in which you were uncomfortable,
it was beyond. I almost died on the operating table.
Yeah.
Okay? It was beyond uncomfortable.
So it's possible that you might have a case, but it's one of those things where I would first say go get all your medical records, gather them up, and then we would be more than happy to take a look at your medical records and determine the extent of damage that we might be able to claim for having been put on that medication. So gather up your medical records, and if you want to drop by Locke and Quinn, we'd be more than happy to look at them for you, Stuart. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it.
All right, thank you. So just like Stuart mentioned in his case,
Mm-hmm.
you know, with the liability, you know, sometimes you can be prescribed a bad medication, or sometimes the doctor can completely screw up,
Mm-hmm.
but then we have to make sure that there are sufficient damages. So in one case I had, actually one of my best friends had a mammogram done, and about 6 months later, she discovered, she was doing a self breast exam, and she discovered a lump in her breast. And so then she went and she had the mammogram done again, and there was a very, very clear cancerous tumor in her breast. And when they went back and they looked at that mammogram done 6 months earlier, that very clear cancerous tumor was on that mammogram done earlier. The problem is that the tumor in size it had grown, but it was of such a size that whether they caught it 6 months earlier or whether they caught it when she caught it herself on self-exam, she still had to have a mastectomy and have that breast removed. So the damage was the same, and we really couldn't say that because of 6 months had gone by, you know, before she had to have the breast removed, that there was any increase in her damages, although there was a very, very clear mistake. The radiologist completely missed seeing that on the mammogram. So clear negligence, clear mistake. But
in another case, maybe that would have caused enough damage to bring a malpractice case, but in this one, where she ended up at the end of it was not any different than
Right. So if it had been like a smaller tumor that could have been caught, that could have been removed without removing the entire breast, you know, then that might have been a case where we could have claimed, had they caught it, she wouldn't have had to have the full mastectomy. But in this case, it was so large in the one that they missed, she was going to have the full mastectomy anyway. So the damages were the same. So we're always looking at cases and saying, okay, well, we have to have all of the elements line up. We have to have the mistake. We have to have the proximate cause that led to the injuries. The injuries have to be severe, and now we have to know that we can also collect against that medical provider.
Yep. So is there a difference if the medical mishap happens at a public hospital versus when it happens at a private hospital?
Oh, yes. And we learned that one by very painful experience, because we took a case all the way up to the Virginia Supreme Court on this. And so basically public hospitals like MCV, UVA to some extent, they can claim basically sovereign immunity because they are funded by the state. And so the idea is that you can't invade the public purse. That's the concept of sovereign immunity, so that when you go to those hospitals, it means that if the doctors are rendering routine care, et cetera, they can claim sovereign immunity if there is a screw up. So you're limited under the Virginia Tort Claims Act to the extent of your remedies. And that, in the case that we took all the way up to the Virginia Supreme Court, what happened in that case, which is the Doug Pike case, and it's a published opinion. So basically what happened was he went in for a procedure to essentially repair a hole in his throat. And they had to remove basically a vein in his arm in order to help with the blood flow and in order to help repair this hole that was in his throat. And so it was really, really important that he not have any venous compromise. That is, that the blood flow remained really steady through his neck area. And so it was really important that his head be kind of kept upright after the surgery. And this was an exceedingly long surgery, so very complicated, long surgery. And what happened was the nursing staff in that case apparently allowed his head to flop over so that the blood flow was compromised. And not just once, but apparently twice, according to the medical records. So we brought that case against the nurse in that case. And basically it came down to and without getting into all the various legalities, because you can get really complicated and that could get really boring actually. But without getting into all the technicalities and the legalese, et cetera, the bottom line is it came down to a level of how much discretion did she have with regard to the medical treatment. And so the court essentially found that because she was just acting within the normal course of her job duties, and her job didn't require a whole lot of, there was discretionary factors, and there are other things that go into the analysis. But the bottom line is that she was entitled to claim immunity, sovereign immunity. And so under those cases, you're limited to, under the Virginia Tort Claims Act, the recovery there, which is much, much more limited than if you were able to bring the case against a private hospital. So I basically, in that case, what it shows you is if you're going to go get medical treatment, you're better off going to a private hospital, because if the same nurse at a private hospital did the same thing, you could recover.
So you could have gone forward.
Right. Yeah. And you could recover up to $2 million in damages and not be limited in your recovery. So that's when people go for medical care, they don't necessarily think about, am I going to a private hospital or a public hospital? And if something mishap's going to happen, is my recovery going to be limited in that regard? And so you can read the Doug Pike case is out there. But unfortunately, we lost that case, and it taught us a good lesson in terms of, I always tell people, just go to a private hospital and go for
seriously. Yeah. So you talked about this a little bit already, but I know this is just something that comes up all the time in our calls. What if the doctor screws up and cuts something during surgery that was not supposed to be cut?
Yeah, and as we talked about before, sometimes that's a risk of the surgery, so really it becomes, do they catch it, right? Do they catch it at the time of surgery? If they catch it at the time of surgery, it's clearly not malpractice, okay? They caught it, they repaired it. It was a possibility that could happen.
Right.
If they catch it shortly after the surgery, even if the person gets a little bit sick, it's still not malpractice because they've essentially caught it. But if they don't catch it and the person gets really, really, really sick, and ends up hospitalized for sepsis, and we have a case where the woman even coded and almost died, and ended up vomiting into her lungs and now having scarred lung tissue, et cetera. So then you do have a case, because it's like, okay, if you're supposed to catch it right away, you're supposed to be looking for those possible risks of surgery right after surgery, and monitoring the patient. So, a lot of really good doctors, but my oral surgeon, after I had oral surgery, he's calling me that night. He's calling me the next day. He's checking on me and saying, give me your symptoms, tell me how you're doing, et cetera. That is a good doctor. That's good patient care. When the patient, on the other hand, or the patient's husband or the patient's mother or whatever, is calling the doctor and saying, look, this doesn't seem right and that doesn't seem right, and the doctor's like, oh, it's fine, it's fine, and don't bring them back in to take a look at them, that's not so good patient care, which could lead to potential malpractice if it continues and there really is something wrong with the person.
Absolutely.
The other thing is, remember when Stuart called in, we do have a lot of medication mix-up cases that I've seen. And, other people like pharmacists and nurses and psychiatrists and psychologists, all of those fall within the medical profession, and even salon and spa cases that are monitored by doctors. So in some of these medication mix-up cases, we've had ones where the medication's been mixed up and the person has maybe felt just a little bit ill for a day and then realized the mix-up. Okay, well, that's clearly a mix-up, but the damage is so minimal.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've had other medication mix-up cases where it's like really severe. We had one woman who was prescribed Haldol, which is like a psychotic medication, when she was just supposed to be prescribed some sort of minimal antidepressant. I can't remember if it was Xanax or Prozac or something. But anyway, the Haldol, I mean, she freaked out and her body was like stiffening up, and she ended up having a complete psychotic episode and having to go by ambulance to the emergency room and having been put in a psych unit and for about 3 days. Okay, well now we have damages. Now that medication mix up clearly resulted in something that
wouldn't have otherwise happened.
Yeah, that would have otherwise happened. And now she's lost 3 days from work, and she's totally freaked out, and she's even got a little bit of post-traumatic stress disorder afterwards when she goes to take any medication now, because she's thinking, is this the right medication? Am I going to flip out, etc.? So each case is different, because you can have a medication mix-up that results in very minimal damage, and you can have another one that results in a lot of damage.
Right.
And
when we were talking to Stuart, one thing you told him was the importance of getting your records.
Right.
So how do you make sure that the records are what they're supposed to be? I mean, I know a lot of times we, in both our personal injury and our medical malpractice cases, see records that are just wrong,
right,
in silly ways almost.
Yeah. Well, most people don't realize that they have a right to go back and correct their records. That if the dates are wrong, if the information is wrong, you can go back and you have a right to say, I want my records corrected. And so, and the doctors are required to go ahead and make those changes. So many folks think that the medical records are just going to be perfect. Well, they're not. A lot of times they're dictated and nobody proofreads them. They're written down quickly.
Right.
And then what happens too in the medical records now, because they're basically computerized, is that initial intake information gets carried throughout the medical records. So if something's wrong in the initial intake, it stays wrong.
Copy paste.
Right. Copy paste. Exactly.
Yes.
And so it stays wrong throughout. And so getting your medical records is actually kind of revealing, because when you read through them, occasionally you'll see, oh my gosh, that's not right.
Right.
And we just had that happen this week.
Right leg, left leg.
Right leg, left leg. Yeah. And when the client looked and said, wait a minute, I wasn't complaining about my left leg. I was complaining about my right leg. And that's just totally wrong in my medical records. And we see that quite frequently. So I tell folks, not only get your medical records, but then read them and make sure that there aren't any inaccuracies. And if there are, go back and say, hey, we want to get this fixed. This isn't right in my record. And if for some reason it won't be fixed, at a minimum, send a letter, say something that this is wrong in my record, so that if it has to be used later for any sort of litigation, we have some record of saying it was wrong.
Trying to correct it. Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. So when's it hard to distinguish if you have a medical malpractice case or a personal injury case? Because they can kind of blur, I think, sometimes.
They do. And they especially blur in these salon and spa cases, and of course these hair replacement cases and whatnot. So typically, if you have a medical doctor who is monitoring or supposed to be monitoring the spa, now that has become, basically supervised by a health professional. And so that falls in the area of medical malpractice. However, in some cases, there might be a, say a hair replacement type company, where they might refer to a doctor outside, but he's not necessarily supervising the company. Well, now it becomes really tricky, because is it medical malpractice, or is this simply a retail, store type thing, a service place, like a haircut place? And so it becomes a little tricky, and you kind of have to look and say, well, what's the setup of the place? If it's simply a haircut, hairstyle, makeup type place, then that's going to just be a simple premises liability case, not a medical malpractice case. But now we've got these spas and salons that are doing, we're doing a little bit of Botox, we're doing a little bit of this other stuff that now requires them to be monitored by a medical doctor. And then that turns it into more of a medical malpractice case, which, we talked about the expert certification. I was going to go back to that because in some cases you don't need an expert certification where it just makes darn good common sense. Like, that basically any average person could say, oh, that should not have happened.
Mm-hmm.
So in your more complicated cases, you will need to get that expert certification. And again, I'm paraphrasing the statute, but basically the statute is that, unless it's just makes good common sense,
mm-hmm.
that was a screw up.
Right.
So there are a certain set of cases where if it's so obvious, okay, they operated on the wrong leg.
Yeah.
Okay. You don't necessarily need to get, an orthopedic surgeon to say
that was a breach
of standard of care, right? And we tell people too, when you go in for medical care and have that body part marked,
mm-hmm.
like with a magic marker, and actually good medical providers will do that. They will actually mark, this is the surgical area,
mm-hmm.
It's this leg, and put a big circle with an L on the left knee, yep. as opposed to not marking anything. So, and then I also tell people, always be vigilant about your care, like, Stuart, listen to your body like Stuart did. And also make sure you've got somebody with you. Having somebody with you, especially when you go into surgery, or making sure that you ask questions,
mm-hmm.
and that you've got somebody there helping to ask those questions, et cetera. So having somebody with you as kind of your advocate
mm-hmm.
is really critical for anybody getting any medical care.
Absolutely. So we've been talking a lot about doctors who mess up and,
right.
might get sued or have to pay claims. So how would I know if my doctor has committed malpractice or been sued for malpractice or been involved in any kind of malpractice litigation?
Right. So if a doctor has been sued and the amount, the settlement amount is $10,000 or more, it has to be reported with the Board of Medicine. So you can actually go to www.vahealthprovider.com. That's www.vahealthprovider.com. And you can search by the name, location, and practice area of the doctor. And then you can go to a tab that shows the reported paid claims that have been made within the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
I always tell folks, before you go see a doctor, research them.
Yeah.
Go look to that website and make sure that they don't have prior claims. Now, some of those claims might be explained by various reasons, but you do want to make sure that you research your doctor, that you know that they are competent, that they have adequate experience. And a lot of these doctors now are getting reviewed, just like lawyers get reviewed, et cetera. So you want to make sure you research that doctor. You want to make sure you're comfortable with the doctor. You want to make sure that they're giving you answers that seem logical, that they are taking adequate time with you. And, doctors are becoming more service-minded, and there are excellent ones that are out there.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for joining us for today's show. Remember, you can capture all of the shows on Facebook Live and now on iTunes. Subscribe to the podcast series, Raising the Bar Law Talk Radio Show. Join us next Wednesday at 9 a.m.